Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a huge economic decision coming out of Colombia. The central bank had a really tough call to make, and their choice to just hold interest rates has kicked off a pretty big debate. So we're going to break down exactly what went down and, why it matters for you.
Everything revolves around this one number, 9.25%. Now, that's the key interest rate for one of the biggest economies in Latin America. But honestly, the story isn't just the number itself. It's the intense debate that was happening behind the scenes to get to it. Okay, let's get into it.
So on September 30th, Colombia's central bank, that's the Banco de la República, they announced they were keeping their main interest rate right where it was, at that 9.25%. They basically just hit pause. No up, no down.
But here's the thing. This was not some simple, everyone agrees kind of decision. Nope. It was a split vote, and that's what makes this whole thing so much more interesting. To really get it, we have to look at all the evidence the board was sifting through, almost like jurors in a big trial trying to figure out the right verdict.
The board was looking at 4 key clues from the economy to make their call, and each one tells a totally different part of the story. You'll see how they were getting pulled in a bunch of different directions.
All right, let's start with clue number 1, and it's the big one, inflation. This is public enemy number 1 for a central bank. Their main weapon to fight rising prices is this very interest rate. You raise rates, it gets more expensive to borrow money, that cools down spending, and hopefully brings inflation down.
And in August, inflation clocked in at 5.1%. That number is a really big deal because it was actually higher than what the bank's own experts thought it would be. It was a huge red flag that this fight against inflation, it's definitely not over.
And you can see the problem right here on this chart. The current rate, 5.1%, is still way above the bank's official target of 3%. Plus, their own team is now saying it's probably going to take even longer to get back to that target than they originally hoped. So clue number 1 is basically screaming, be careful.
Okay, let's look at clue number 2, which builds on this idea. It's what people think inflation is going to do in the future. And this is so important for central banks. Because look, if everyone expects prices to keep going up, they start acting that way. And it can actually make it happen. And here's the data to back that up. Analysts' expectations are just stuck way above that target. They're predicting 5% inflation for next year, and it's still at 4% the year after that. This is another one of those critical signals telling the bank, hey, this inflation thing is sticky.
But what about the other side of the coin, the actual strength of the economy? See, a central bank can't just slam the brakes to fight inflation without worrying about, crashing the whole economy. So how's Colombia's economy actually holding up? Well, surprisingly strong. It's kind of wild. While inflation is this massive headache, the economy itself grew by 2.5% in the second quarter, which was pretty much exactly what everyone was expecting. This is not an economy on the ropes. It's showing some really solid growth, which makes the bank's decision way more complicated.
So what's behind that growth? Well, the clue here is that the strength is coming from inside the country. You've got strong domestic demand, people are still spending, and there's even been a nice little bump in investment. Now, this is the evidence that some of those board members were probably pointing to, saying, see, the economy's doing fine, maybe we can cut rates a little.
And finally, the last clue. The board had to look beyond Colombia's borders at the whole global picture. Because, as we know, no economy exists in a vacuum. What happens out there really matters.
And the clues from the rest of the world were, well, they were a mixed bag. On one hand, global financial conditions have loosened up a bit, which is good. But on the other hand, you've still got a ton of uncertainty, especially from U.S. trade policy and other geopolitical stuff. It's a real toss-up.
So you've got all this conflicting evidence on the table, right? Inflation is sticky, but the economy is growing. So what was the final verdict? This is where it gets really interesting, because the board was clearly torn. The decision to hold that rate at 9.25% was anything but unanimous. Look at this. 4 directors voted to hold, but 2 of them wanted to get aggressive and cut the rate by 0.5%, and another one wanted a smaller 0.25% cut. This just shows you there was a real live debate happening right there inside the central bank.
So for the majority, the 4 people who won the vote, it all came down to one word, caution. They looked at all those clues we just went through and decided that the risk of inflation staying too high was just bigger than the risk of slowing down the economy. For them, the inflation clues won out over the growth clues.
A split vote like this tells you one thing for sure. This debate is far from over.
This decision feels more like a temporary truce than a final peace treaty in the war against inflation. So the big question is, what should we be watching for now?
Well, the bank has been really clear about this. They said any moves they make in the future are going to depend on how these key things change. And what are they watching? The very same clues we just looked at: how inflation is doing, how strong the economy is, and that whole balance of risks both at home and around the world.
This decision was just a pause, right? Not the final destination. And it leaves this huge question mark hanging over the entire Colombian economy. Now, everyone is just wondering what's going to happen at the next meeting on October 31st. Is caution going to win out again? Or will those arguments for a rate cut finally get the votes? We are definitely going to be watching.